and welcome to the Dreamer Comics podcast. I'm your host, Omar Spahi, and today we got my man, Brennan Wagner.
Hey, Omar.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking comic books.
Totally.
I love it, man. And you've primarily, up to now, been like a colorist.
I grew up illustrating, painting. My father, of course, is Matt Wagner, so who is at this point a staple and a legend in our industry. He's worked for every publisher practically.
Yep.
So growing up in his studio, I, of course, dabbled with every kind of artistic thing. And at one point in my life, I got very much into photography as well. I was, in college, I was the lead photographer for the paper, the school newspaper. Mm-hmm. So for a while, I was, I was kind of torn between all these different art forms. Of course, all inspired by my love of storytelling and comic books.
And you just grew up completely like surrounded by art. Like it seems like you just had an instinct for it and a passion for it.
So yeah, Omar is here for the con, but I live here, and I've been going to cons since I could walk. My dad used to even take me out of school to go to conventions. It's just something that I always grew up with. So I'm almost jaded at this point when it comes to the con experience. I've done them all.
I'm sure, yeah. If you grew up kind of just going from place to place on the weekend, and it's great because you meet people doing that process, and especially being like a young person coming up, you kind of like already networking just by being a kid and being out.
Yep, and people love kids of creators. I always got a pretty golden treatment. A couple artists in particular I could give a shout out to were very, very not only influential but nice to me as a kid. They sort of took my hand and showed me some of the ropes. Jim Mahfood is one of those, really great guy. He was always so nice to me. Scott Morse, Dave Stewart, a fellow colorist, showed me a bunch of tricks. So yeah, going to cons is really helpful, the networking, but also just the exposure to the world, seeing it and being able to recognize what is new and what is just reoccurring. A lot of these guys come to the cons and they're just kind of selling the same stuff, doing the same thing, same prints, same stuff over and over again. And I'm really into the stories, so I don't table that much at cons anymore. I'm more into just getting the stories out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
And so whenever you have a book that's coming out, do you try to link the colors with whatever style the mood is, or how do you kind of pick the colors as far as like, are you kind of like, is there usually like a pre-existing template, or you have something in mind from the get-go, or what? Is it go based on story, or is it kind of more like, this is the color of the character, so I'm going to kind of stick to this way of it?
All and in between. It varies from project to project, and no two projects I've ever done have been the same as far as the amount of notes and the types of notes that I get. Some artists that I've worked with are extremely critical and will, give me tons of notes back. Those artists I actually don't really like to work with and have kind of weeded them out of my circle of artists that I work for because I can't really afford the time to redo stuff. I just need to plow through. Yeah. So it helps a lot to get early color notes. On Mage, I get very, very few color notes. When I started this book with my dad, he, of course, had certain expectations. This is one of his love childs right here. This is his baby, Mage and Grendel.
It's your brother, then.
Yes. Yes, I've known Mage since I was very little.
I love it. And how did you come to start working on Mage? What was the process?
So with Mage, it was at first, it was a tryout page, and I nailed it. My dad thought it looked really great. Growing up in his studio and with his art, I not only know his sensibilities, but I share them. We think the same as far as storytelling goes. I approach color very much from a storytelling standpoint. I'm not trying to paint a beautiful picture every time. I'm not trying to hang this work necessarily. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I'm trying to make a nice cover or print, something that's frameable, hangable. But for the most part, the flow of the story and the ability to draw the eye to certain narrative moments that are impactful and important. That's really what matters in the world of coloring for comic books.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important because you have the ability to draw people's eye to where you want to take it.
Right.
And so that's really cool. So break down for people who don't know what coloring is or how to do it. Break down a little bit about coloring.
So coloring for everyone is probably a little bit different, from person to person. Some people do it traditionally. Guys like Matt Hollingsworth, who is a staple in our industry for color. He's been doing it for many, many years. He's won many awards for it. He is awesome, and he used to do this stuff traditionally, painting. Nowadays, he does it digital, but I follow him, and he's doing a lot of painting on traditional paper and then scanning it to get textures. And then he's incorporating the two. Now, I don't do that. I do all of my stuff digitally. I use a handful of brushes that I got from, I'll name drop again, the man Dave Stewart. He's amazing. He taught me a few tricks, and he gave me a few brushes, I want to say 7 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And ever since then, I have just been flying with that bag of tricks and those few brushes. It's made it really easy for me. And I think it's key to limit your brushes too. I really, on Mage, I'm using, I think, just 2 digital brushes. I know that some people use a lot of digital brushes and they use a lot of layers. I find that the more I get bogged down by the layers and the brushes and the technical choices, I lose sense of the flow of paint, and really in that classic sense of just painting, just applying marks to a page, because the more marks you make, the likely it's going to look less digital. If the first time you make a digital mark with a digital brush, it does read very digital, until you muck it up with a few more marks. Then it starts to look organic. It starts to look real, and that's kind of the look that I'm always going for with color. Is sort of like a painterly look. I'm inspired a lot by the Impressionist painters, and the way that they represent reality through brushstrokes, suggestive brushstrokes. So that's what I'm trying to achieve.
That's cool. I mean, the detail that you go into to make sure that it looks organic is really impressive. Whenever you're going and you're looking at like these different colors, what's the process like to getting the colors on the page?
So you asked, is there notes? Do I get a palette ahead of time? I do not usually get a palette per se. I don't get this scene has a purple sky. I don't get notes like that. The notes that I get are more continuity things. This character has a red cape. That character is African American. These kind of things are important because going back and redoing that stuff is a pain in the ass. For the most part, I'm hired by artists because they trust me. They trust that what I'm going to do is going to be right the first time around, not the second, third, fourth, fifth. So for the most part, I just kind of dive in and do what I think is appropriate. Again, it's all storytelling. So I read the script. I look at the art and I decide, based on the line art and the shading, what the lighting would be and what appropriate time of day it should be, what the mood should be. Yeah.
And when it comes to doing flatting, do you do flats before you do the full colors?
Oh, well, I hire out my flats, okay. Which is the only way to do it. If you want to make money, sometimes I'll flat something myself if it's just, really simple. Here's a cover, for example, that I flatted myself because this would be silly to hire out.
Yeah.
This took all of 5 minutes to flat myself.
So let's talk about flatting real quick. For those who don't know, what is flatting?
So yes, when I receive my work, it is all black and white usually, unless there's ink wash or gray tones of some kind. But typically, it's just ink work. And the flatting is creating polygons that fit all of the shapes. Polygons that fit the figures, polygons that fit buildings, clothing, skin. This is important for me because when I have those flats, I'm able to very easily select areas to focus on and work within. It's just a tedious step. It's a tedious step that takes sometimes a little too long, and it's worth hiring out. I pay, a percentage of what I make on the page. Usually it's like 10% of what I'm making. And I hire it out. I'll send it to. I have a few different flatters. I'll send it out, and they'll send back chunks at a time or whatever, and it just streamlines the process.
Absolutely,
makes it go quicker.
Every colorist I talk to, sends out their flats.
Yeah,
because it becomes this like tedious process where like you're doing the work like twice kind of, because it feels like you're doing it once and then you're doing it again.
Yep.
So
almost 3 times, because the flats that I receive are neon almost in color. They're like greens and pinks and blue, like crazy absurd colors. And so there's a step even in between where I have to lay in the base palette of flats before I even start rendering or making any marks or choosing lighting or textures or anything. And I know some people that actually they hire that stage out as well. So they do it's a three-tier process. They have someone flat it, and then they have someone that knows their color sensibilities, lay in a palette, and then they will do the rendering themselves. I like to lay in my own palettes though, because I like to be in control of the end color.
And so let's talk about what coloring is. So let's talk about the final step of it. How would you kind of describe the process of coloring? Do you are you looking at where the light is coming from and kind of making adjustments based on that? Like the light is hitting his face here, so I have to make this side less beige or more white, or how? I'm curious because I really don't know the process behind coloring.
There's really no formula that you apply then to each panel. Mm-hmm. Every panel deserves its own approach. Some I start with a light source. Some I know, especially if characters are backlit, if they're silhouetted somewhat, I know the background's going to be really light. But it doesn't always start with a light source. Sometimes it starts with colors and textures. I just kind of feel it out. It really depends on the moment. And again, I was talking about storytelling. That's really key, is I'm looking for what's important in the scene. My father told me growing up, one of the most important things, I've always retained this, is when you start a page, pick a panel. That is the panel you will render the most. That's the most important panel. Then pick a spot in that panel. That's the spot you render the most. Everything else can be less, because the whole point is to draw the eye to one spot. And our eyes are usually drawn to finer detail and more rendering. So just simply by rendering one panel more than the others, you will draw the eye. So that's usually where I start. Is I'll look at a page and I will see a panel that it sort of strikes me as being narratively important, and I'll usually start there, and then I'll kind of work out from there. It might be the middle of the page, it might be the bottom of the page. It depends on what I think is important.
That's so cool. I mean, it's so important and so amazing that you're able to tell that story. So another project I'm really excited about is Hillbilly.
Yes.
How did that kind of come to be, and how did you kind of get involved with Hillbilly?
So Eric Powell is the writer, editor, producer, everything.
Yeah.
Because Eric runs his own production company. That would be Albatross Funny Books. He's doing really great stuff these days, Eric. And I did a book for Albatross that Eric did not write, but he was editor of, called Nom Wolf, and that was with Fabian Rangal Jr. Hope I'm saying this right. Fabian Rangal Jr. and Logan Farber illustrating, and I colored that book for them. That was 4 issues, exactly what it sounds like. Vietnam with a werewolf. It was fucking awesome. And I've colored a few other things for Eric for Albatross, little things. I did a thing for Spook House. He has short horror shorts that he puts out called Spook House. They're great, phenomenal. And I've done little things for Eric, but he hit me up to do some hillbilly because he had gotten a new artist, Simone DeMeo, European guy, really, really phenomenal stuff. Simone is now doing work on Power Rangers and Old Man Logan. But Simone and I teamed up for 2 issues of hillbilly, and it was a hoot. Very fun stuff.
That's awesome. And when it comes to like you as an artist, what kind of art did you grow up with? I know you grew up with photography, but like, how did you do like freehand, just drawing with a pencil? Did you kind of do,
So
claymation? I don't know what you were into.
I did do a little claymation actually.
I love it.
I love sculpture too. A close family friend of ours is Randy Bowen, who is one of the greatest sculptors in comic books. He's really phenomenal. Bowen Designs. And I grew up with a lot of his sculptures and statues, and that was always inspiring to me. So I dabbled a little bit with sculpture. It translates pretty easily. If you know how to draw a figure, you can quickly learn how to sculpt that figure in the round. And I dabbled with all kinds of art stuff, but it was always sketching, really. That was the main thing. And yeah, with a pencil, like you said. Always with a pencil. And I wouldn't advocate for this for everyone, but I did a lot of not paying attention in my classes.
Yep.
I did a lot of not doing homework and instead drawing. I would turn in assignments with drawings on them, hoping I would get grades for them. I just did a lot of drawing. I would have teachers rip drawings away from me and tell me to pay attention. And I didn't. I kept drawing, and it all worked out for me. You know, the key is to really just chase what you love and what your tendencies and inclinations are towards.
Now, let's talk about like drawing in school. Like, did you go to school after, like an art school?
After high school, I went to a public school high school. After that, I went to a 4-year university in the south of Oregon called Southern Oregon University. It's in an awesome little town called Ashland that holds the Shakespeare Festival.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of that.
And I liked it enough, but it had a very small town vibe. I kind of got a few times the feeling that I was the only one in the art class really, really trying for something more. And so I wanted to leave. I came back to Portland. I also had a love interest at the time in Portland, and making frequent trips up to there, it's like a 6-hour drive, was just getting crazy. So I moved up to Portland, and I started going to PSU there. That's a university that's right in the heart of the city of Portland. And that was really great, more urban. So I kind of got that exposure, and I took all different art classes there. Ultimately, I found that I was spending a lot of my parents' money to sit in a room and draw a naked guy. I would fill my schedule with classes that I'd already taken just because I liked doing that stuff.
Yeah.
So that would be life drawing, life painting, life sculpture, naked people. Anything with a naked person, it's the absolute best way to learn. And anyone who wants to get into comic books should definitely go draw naked people. I cannot recommend it enough.
I love it.
But I found that was just eating up all my time and my parents' money, and I dropped out. And I started working, making a little money here and there, started growing weed. I decided that all I could do was just keep at this, and the opportunities eventually came through my dad and through my aunt Diana Schutz, who's a famous editor for Dark Horse for many, many years.
And yeah, I mean, you in Portland, it's kind of the right place because there's so many comic book companies. It's kind of like, it used to be like New York was the old school mecca for like Marvel and DC, and then now Portland's kind of there with Dark Horse, Image, and IDW has an office there. There's a lot of comic book companies and a lot of comic book creators who live out there.
Yes, Portland is definitely a growing hub. Like you said, Image just moved there. Oni Press has been there forever. One of my first jobs was interning at Oni, actually.
How long did you intern at Oni for?
Less than a year.
What was it like? Was it?
I was just boxing. I was just boxing and shipping. I wasn't doing anything artistic. I assumed foolishly that if you intern at a position like that, you can kind of slip in your work and they'll notice. It doesn't really work that way. The best way to get your stuff noticed in comics is to just do it, to just sit down and draw and do it.
Absolutely.
There's no better way. You know, comics is truly a merit-based industry. Your resume doesn't matter. You could be a convicted felon. Doesn't matter. The work is what matters, and the editors only see the work. The editors are only going to rehire you if you get that work in on time.
Yep.
So deadlines are very important as well.
You got to be nice, fast, and good. Those are the trifecta.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that you say that, because it's like, I feel like I've interviewed a lot of people who talk about interning as like, literally boxing and unboxing and like doing stuff like that.
Yep.
And it's really interesting because people in like high positions started off as interns. And it's weird to see that like growth, and that's not until they leave and then kind of like come back that they're like, oh, okay, yeah, you are something else. You are still in the comic book industry, sticking around. And a lot of people don't do that. There's a lot of people who just kind of like, oh, I had a job and it was over now. And it's cool to see, like, whenever it's always important to be nice to interns, because you never know.
You never know.
You never know what intern is going to be the boss in 10 years.
That's very true.
And so it's always important to get out there and meet your fellow comic book
enthusiasts.
Yes. I love it. That's a great word.
Yes.
So what was your first like transition into comic books, like getting paid to make comics and getting paid to make art?
So the first time I was ever paid to color something was an 8-page short story in a Dark Horse Presents
anthology, or those are like anthologies, right?
Yeah, it's an anthology publication, little short stories. This short story was called The Fish Police BC. So Fish Police was created in the wake of the Ninja Turtles, when literally everything had to be an animal. And an animal cop, too. That was huge. So this Fish Police is exactly that. Police that are fish under the water is very weird. And this one 8-page short story was even weirder. It was Fish Police BC. So it was fish that were police that were also dinosaurs?
What?
Like it was Jurassic as well. It was very weird. It was 8 pages. When I look back on it now, it makes me cringe what I did on it. But that was it. My aunt got me that gig. I think it paid $20 a page. Maybe it was 15. Horrendously low. And that led to some more stuff. My real first gig, though, was for Dynamite, doing a Sherlock Holmes story. It was 5 issues, and it was a totally fun little story. It was the first time that I dealt with serious deadlines, with monthly publication schedule that just can't be missed, because these printers or these publishers have a date with the printer. And if they don't meet it, then they will suffer financially.
Absolutely. The fans will suffer.
Everyone suffers.
Everyone suffers.
Yes. So that was the first time that I got a serious gig there. From there, that led to other gigs with Dynamite. That kind of opened the door for Dynamite for me. And I worked for Dynamite for many years, doing stuff for my dad and the like for them.
What was your first project that what was the next project at Dynamite? What else did you work on there?
So after the Sherlock Holmes run was almost a trial to do a more serious book with my dad writing, and that would be The Shadow Year One. So that was Wilfredo Torres illustrating, beautiful work, and my father writing. It was to be an origin story that hadn't really been explored yet for the Shadow, how he came to the city, how he donned the cape. We know how he got his powers over in China, but no one really knows how he became the vigilante of New York. So, or whatever his city's called. I think it's New York.
He is one of the oldest pulp heroes.
Yes.
For Dynamite.
Yes, of course, the Shadow predates the Batman and any other dark caped vigilante today. He's almost the predecessor to any of that trope.
So what's it like working with your dad? Like, is it, Do you enjoy the process? Is it still weird for you? Is it like is it weird? I feel like it would be weird for me, but it's do you enjoy the process of working with your dad, or what was it like when you first started working with him?
Well, because I grew up going to cons with my dad and illustrating alongside him, even sitting at his table and illustrating, and just always being around him and doing that. Our lexicon is the same, so we use similar words, and he knows how to talk to me about my stuff. He knows that a heavy hand is too much with me, so I didn't always get just straight lessons or anything like that. But encouragement, definitely, all along the way. And working with him at first was a little stressful because I wasn't quite up to snuff yet. When I first started coloring for him, I made mistakes. The first 3 pages of The Shadow Year One, I sat down at a coffee shop and did all 3 pages in one sitting, sent them off, and he told me they looked like shit. And he came down hard on me, and it hurt, but in retrospect, it was exactly what I needed to hear. He was right, and I needed, before I started a serious project like that, to have a little reality check, a little humility. I wasn't a pro yet. Even though I suddenly felt like one because I was doing this big book with a big character, and it's important to always just stay open to learning. Even if you think you're good, you ain't.
Yeah, that's 100%. I mean, you think about the greatest. I feel like the greatest are always still learning, always still trying to get better at their craft, always trying to push the envelope.
Yes, they're self-critical.
They're self-critical, and you have to be. You have
Yes.
to be able to say, okay, like, this is not where it should be. How can I get it there?
Yep.
And I think that's something that's really important. So I wanted to ask you a question about your past. When was a moment in comic books when you felt like you weren't going to make it, that you didn't know if you could continue in comics or if you would work in comics? Was there a moment along the way in this whole past where you were like, okay, maybe I'm not going to do comics, maybe I'm going to have to switch to doing something else?
I've had a few of these moments. They usually come from lack of pay, deadline rushing, editors breathing down my neck. There's problems here and there,
Yeah.
and they will give you doubt, but you just got to stay true. I recently had what can only be described as a scandal with DC Comics. Was hired to color a full issue of Batman. All along the way told that it was phenomenal work, only to have the issue pulled from me last minute after completing the whole thing, just to be recolored. I was paid, so I will say that, and it is great to get paid in this industry.
Yeah. But that's
not
tough
everyone does.
To be like, oh, I'm working on something that is like a career accomplishment. Like working on Batman is something that's like people aspire to do, and to be.
This was my first full issue for DC. I had done covers before, but this was the first time I had done a full issue of interior storytelling pages.
Yeah. And that's just tough to go through, and I can only imagine that it's just like you feel the sense of like lowness when you're like, oh, what happened? Like, why did this happen? So it's I'm sorry you had to go through that, and you're doing great now. You're coloring everything. So
yeah, that whole thing gave me a moment of weakness that was maybe an afternoon where I considered a lateral career shift.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Quickly doused that by, I got some new pages in my email and started working on them, and there you go. You just got to keep trucking along.
Absolutely, that's the process. We all have highs and lows in the comic book industry,
Mm-hmm.
but that's what it's like.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask you about your other art now, because you do different art styles as well. You don't just do colors; you also do penciling, inking, the whole array. So what are you? How did you kind of come into? I know you did that since you were growing up, but what have you been working on like with that?
Lately, it's hard to squeeze in the moments. I spend a lot of time coloring lately. And I'm a newly married man, so I've been spending a lot of time with my wife and, kind of being a husband. But I'm finding moments here and there to slip in my own work. I've been doing a lot of digital painting lately. Like you said, I grew up doing this penciling and inking traditionally the way that my father does. I have a vast array of influences. Like I said, I'm really, really into impressionist painters. Mm-hmm. Also, turn of the century ad illustrators, Bob Peak and other guys. I think they were so good, and a lot of those guys were influential on modern day comic book artists. We wouldn't really have the same kind of look that we do in comics today if it weren't for those guys. So I'm looking at a lot of that work these days and trying to go for kind of a style like that.
Who are some of your biggest influences in comics?
Well, my father, obviously. But I like all the greats. I love me some Mike Mignola. Alex Toth. He's the man, really. If I could pick one, that's probably Alex Toth. Colorists too. I'm impressed with a bunch of different colorists these days. I think Jordy is doing really great work. Like I said, Dave Stewart taught me pretty much everything I know, and he's the man. I still steal his palettes all the time from Google.
I love it. Yeah, Jordy's. I've seen her work everywhere. She's like on every book. It seems like it's crazy.
Yeah, and that's the thing about. And I think why I'd ultimately like to make a lateral shift out of coloring is I'm just not fast enough. I spend a lot of time per panel getting the textures and stuff that I like. And I find these days the most successful colorists are actually the guys who are cranking it out.
Yep.
Cranking it out. You mentioned Jordy's on everything. Dave Stewart somehow manages to, I think one time I saw him, he told me he colors at least 5 pages a day.
Wow.
Which is insane to me. But, hey, more power to him, you know?
I mean, it comes with, I think, practice, like it's interesting. I was talking about speed reading recently and like how I read slow, but how if you're reading all the time, if you're just sitting there just doing nothing but reading, all of a sudden you pick up to learn to read faster. You have to because it's your livelihood.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this kind of crazy thing that I'm like, there's no way I could read 100 pages in a day, and then all of a sudden you're like, I read 200 today.
Well, I think what you do is you pick up how to work smarter, not harder. You know, efficiency is everything, especially in comic books. Economy. You want to spend a certain amount of time per panel, per page, and you got to move on because the reader's only going to spend so much on each page.
It's true.
This, like I said earlier, this is not framed, hung art. This is a story. This is a book. So you gotta keep it moving.
Yeah, people will read the text, look at the picture, and move on. Like that's
right.
They're not going to sit there and stare at a panel. There's the chance that it might, and if it's really something that like is a really important story moment, you might have more of a chance where you're like, "Whoa, I can't believe this happened," or that's happened. But most of the time, you're going to look at it, take 5 seconds, and move on. And it's an interesting thing because one thing I heard that's kind of always stuck with me though is whenever you're looking through a comic book. Like I'm gonna pick up this issue of Mage. Is the human mind doesn't think in movement. It thinks in still images and moments. So like you see here like this panel of picking her up by the neck. Like you think of that as a moment. You're like, okay, cool. Like, and that kind of draws my eye in right there because you see a bunch of purple on the page and then all of a sudden there's this black that kind of just like.
And I think perhaps that's what's so accessible and awesome about comic books is they stride that line between still image and movement. The still images are meant to convey movement. There's a kinetic energy, at least in the good books. There's a kinetic energy to the art. It keeps your eye moving. It keeps the story moving, and yet it is also a still image that can be appreciated in the moment. When we watch television, if we binge watch a Netflix show like Ozark, we're not stopping and enjoying a still frame of some buzzards for 10 minutes at a time. We see the buzzards for a second. They stick their narrative moment in there, and then it's on to the next because really the art form and the experience for the viewer is one of movement. It's one that progresses, and you're much like a play or anything like that. You really you're getting the most enjoyment out of the whole, not the individual parts of it.
Absolutely. And do you draw a lot of inspirations from like other art forms? So like if you go to a museum or you go to a play, do you kind of take some of that and like, hey, how can I incorporate this into my work? Or are you kind of just going and like enjoying that experience separate than comics? Or is it kind of do you ever like think of like cross pollination or like what they've done here? Like, oh, I kind of liked how that was the colors there or the lighting there or anything like that. Do you ever kind of bring it in?
As an illustrator and painter colorist, you're always looking at life in general to see how form, shape, light works. It's complicated. It's not something that you get even after a lifetime of working on it. You are always having to look and to understand things. So yeah, I mean, that is the case when I go to a play or I see a show. I don't know that I'm necessarily taking certain moments or even scenes or episodes or anything like that and storing them and saying, I'm going to use that in the next issue. But it's all part of it. It's all part of, my brain is going to make decisions based on my whole life's experiences. And certainly a large part of that is entertainment. Yeah, like plays and television, movies, all the art forms, yes, have influence and are important to the work that I do in comic books.
Yeah, me too. One of our mutual friends, Steven Siegel, is
great guy.
Yeah, one of my closest friends is he has been super influential to me and kind of has changed my way of thinking. And he said to me, if I go back and just read comic books, and like you're just going to be making a copy of a coffee, you have to draw from outside of life. You have to draw from here and from there and different experiences. You have to go out and live.
Right.
And I thought that was some really great advice that a lot of people don't give in comics, because people are like, no, read more comics, find out what's going on, and then do that differently and do that better. And then it's like, oh, go out and have your own experiences and pick up on those and make it real, make it genuine.
Steve is really great with the advice. Steve is the guy actually who gave me the advice to pursue comic books instead of photography.
Oh,
many
wow.
years ago.
Really?
Many years ago. I must have been 17 or 18 years old. I was at a convention, I think it was San Diego, and I had a portfolio of both illustration work, painted work, and photography. And Steve looked at both and he said, you have an eye for composition, for color, for life and art and storytelling. But you have a talent to be able to illustrate and draw, and that's something not everyone has. Everyone can point a camera at something and use their inner creative mind to make art out of it with a camera. But the talent to draw is rare, he said, and he's right. He's absolutely right, and he said I would regret it down the line if I ever lost that talent, and that really stuck with me. Especially now, it seems like everyone takes photos of everything. We're in the age of like self-documentation. So I feel like I'm unneeded in that area.
There's always need for photographers, but I agree with Steve that your art is fantastic. So I think he made the right call, and I think you did by listening and jumping into comics.
Yeah, Steve's really great. He married me too.
He did.
So
He's your
that was nice.
So I have one final question for you. I like to end all my shows by asking this question, so you may have heard it. But what advice do you have for any future colorists or comic book creators?
I would say really stick with it. It's hard to. It's very easy to just want to make this a hobby. Because there's so much competition in comic books. Nowadays, the market seems so saturated. But the plus is that there are so many ways to publish now. If you want to do this and you're trying to get into this industry, find an avenue that works for you. It may not be the publisher. You know, you don't necessarily need to go to an editor. Maybe you just need to draw something and put it up on a blog over and over again until people start noticing. That's all this industry, is people looking at stuff and saying, I like that. And if the people aren't doing that, then you're not doing something right. So you need to adjust.
Yeah.
And eventually you'll get it right. You'll know when you get it right because people will start noticing.
Yep. I mean, I do that myself. I go out there and I post a new webcomic page every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So
Nice.
every single week, I post a new image 3 times and just kind of like let people read my story because I'm proud of it and I want it to get out there to as many people as I can.
Yep.
And that's what it's about. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking comics.
Totally. Yep. Had a great time.